Our sesquicentennial speaker for today is the Reverend Robert Vaughn. The Reverend Mr. Vaughn is a graduate of Huntington College and Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Upon graduating from Candler School of Theology at Emory, he came to this church as an associate minister and stayed for 2 years. Has subsequently distinguished himself in service of churches throughout the Alabama-West Florida Conference. I might parenthetically say, the Reverend Mr. Vaughn and I graduated together from Emory University. We have been not only classmates but colleagues through the years. I have developed a great admiration for Bob and the kind of ministry that he has offered to people. I had the opportunity to be his district superintendent for several years while I was superintendent in Dothan. I do not know of a minister I have ever worked with who has worked harder or distinguished himself more in the service of God to the United Methodist Church than has Bob. So this morning I introduce to you a man who is known by this church because of his service in it, and a man who has distinguished himself as a United Methodist preacher. Reverend Robert Vaughn, we welcome you to the pulpit of the First United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Dr. Butts. One of the privileges of the Methodist minister is to heap undue praise upon a fellow minister. Tom, that's the best introduction I have received since the time that the man who was to introduce me in a speaking engagement didn't show up, and I had to introduce myself. I feel most flattered to have the privilege of returning to preach here again. My last sermon was 22 years ago, and you can be thankful for that. I've listened to the eloquence of my dear friend Ham Wilson, who was most active here 22 years ago as well. And Ham, I thought about you and Louise with great pride as I saw over the television program where they were naming a building after you, and there on the building was your name. And the thought came to me, my name is inscribed here. You know where it is? Well, it so happens when I was a youngster, when this building was being built, we used to play in this unfinished building, a great time we had every afternoon. There's no place more glorious to play for boys and girls than an unfinished building. The sand, the bricks, the lumber, everything. And every day the women used to stencil the tiles, the decorative tiles that now you see in the ceiling of this great cathedral. And we would come by, and on the bottom part of that tile, we would inscribe our names. So, I believe if you will look up toward over a little bit, on the underside, where neither wind, nor rain, nor time will destroy it, you will find the name of Robert Vaughn etched there. Tom, I was somewhat apprehensive when I saw your sermon subject this morning at 8:30, $1 million and a bale of hay. I wondered, and then I just knew it could have no reflection upon me. That wonderful introduction, you don't always get one like that, a preacher down in Miami who was speaking to a large gathering of a large convention. He was well known, and just his name was synonymous with church and religion alone. And a speaker, an introducer, said about him, he said, Dr. Robertson, I don't know what he is. He may be a medical doctor. He may be a dentist. I don't know, but here he is. And when Dr. Robertson stood to his feet, he said, my dear brother, I'm not a medical doctor. I would deem it a privilege to be a member of that great profession. Neither am I a dentist, a proud profession. It says, it so happens that I'm a veterinarian, and I specialize in horses and their relatives, and this is the first time I've had one of my patients introduce me. Thank you, Tom, for that fine introduction. It is good to look out across this spacious congregation and see so many of you that I have known over the years. And those of you who know me well, please say nothing and I will speak to you later. But it is a genuine pleasure for me to be here. I'm delighted that my wife, Verna, is here. Verna, will you please stand up? I do this for your protection. For your protection. This building and this congregation and this place holds sacred memories for us. When we were assigned here, our 2-year-old daughter, Berta, brought her in the side door to see the sanctuary for the first time. And she was holding her in her arms, holding her up. She was about, 2.5 years of age. And the minute she walked into the sanctuary and the noonday sun was at its most glorious, and these beautiful stained glass windows were arrayed in all of their splendor. And we will never forget the reaction of our 2.5-year-old daughter when she came in her mother's arms in the center of it. She said, "Oh!" Its beauty took her breath away. And I know that it has inspired you in the same way over the years. Our son was baptized here in the front of this sanctuary. He was several months of age. I wanted to perform the role of a parent and make the vows for him of a parent. And so Dr. Charles Forrest baptized our son at that tender age. Yesterday in Park Ridge, Illinois, I had the pleasure of marrying that 25-year-old son to a lovely girl from Park Ridge, Illinois. But I received somewhat of a shock. It was a very beautiful church. The stained glass windows would have rivaled the medieval glass windows in York, England. Beautiful. We had just pronounced them man and wife. They had stood and ready to leave, and the recessional hymn had been begun in all of its majesty. They came down arm in arm and came down the step, and just as they got to the beginning of the row, he reached down and swooped her up in his arms and ran out of the church. Well, I can tell you that broke up church. I saw a lot of necks that had been somewhat stiff during the ceremony began to loosen up with laughter. I couldn't believe it. Later on, I told them that must be a Park Ridge custom. We don't do that in the South. In fact, we hardly ever pick a woman and carry her up off of the threshold any longer. Somebody spoke up and said, "They're all too large." No. But I told them I was going to see that son attended the Rhett Butler School of Charm for the next 2 years to learn how to properly escort a woman down the aisle. He had been raised in the church all of his life, and I felt that he was so happy at it all that he'll do something just a little bit different. It's a pleasure to be here and be with these fine ministers, these colleagues of mine. It is a pleasure. I told them as we came in, I just hope there are as many people in the congregation as we have ministers this morning. And I see that there is. Standing out in the vestibule, I couldn't help but remember as the choir began their number prior to processing, about the time that we added speakers out in the vestibule so that we could hear the sound of the organ, knowing when to process. And the very first Sunday that those elaborate speakers were placed out there, someone had been given the signal back here when to throw it so that we could hear the organ in the vestibule. The switch was thrown, and then blaring out, of all things, was rock and roll music from station WBAM. What a glorious service we had that morning. I am delighted to be a part of this 150th year celebration, the sesquicentennial. I come not as a visitor or as a stranger. I am a part of this endless line of splendor, and I rejoice in the fact of it. The scripture lesson that Al Norris read for you this morning is a scene that can be seen even today throughout the near and far east. It's a street scene. In the center of the street, there are a great number of people competing for space there. We look on the shady side of the street, and there we see the merchants as they are sitting on their pillars of silk with their wares and trinkets arrayed before them. And then we squint through the noonday sun, And on the other side of the street, we see a motley crew. It is a group of people huddled, vying for some sitting space or standing space on that sunny side of the street. They are the diseased, the infirm, the lame, the blind, the halt, and the withered. And they have come to that place because rumor has it that Simon Peter is going to walk down that street. And they are there hopeful, as they have heard that the very shadow of Simon Peter, if it falls upon them, then they will be cured of whatever disease or infirmity that they might have. Now, I know that this idea that the shadow of Peter has some strange power to heal may seem to some to be superstitious and sentimental. But through it we can see a note that here there is something powerful and something tremendous. Here we see the very idea that it displays. Here we see the unconscious and the far-reaching influence of a person's life when they are filled with the power of God. In India, there's a superstition that if the shadow of an outcast falls upon you, then you become contaminated by that shadow. And also the belief that the shadow of a good person, as it falls upon you, that then you will receive some of their goodness. It was for this reason that so many hundreds of thousands of people pushed in upon that great holy man of India, Gandhi, because they were in great hopes that just his mere shadow might fall upon them, and then a part of his goodness would be imparted to their body and to their lives. Shadows have always intrigued me. Late in the evening, I used to run along the sidewalk and to see if I could run and catch my shadow. And various times of the day, I was intrigued by the fact that the shadow in the late in the evening would stretch, and stretch. The tower of this church is 112 feet tall. The other day, Al Nice called and he said, we need to know your scripture and your sermon topic. Well, I'd been invited a year and a half ago to preach this morning. Last October, or September it was, I saw Al and I said, Al, I'm going to be with you in a couple of weeks. He said, for what? I said, I've been invited to preach the second Sunday in October. And he looked at me rather strange and he said, that's next year. I'd never been invited anywhere. A year and a half in advance. I told him, if you'd let me come when I wanted to, I would have known. I'll let you know the first thing in the morning. I said, do something for me. Go out and measure the shadow of that tower. The whole idea began to come into my mind, the shadow of influence that this church has cast upon the lives of people around the world. He told me this morning, he said at 11 o'clock when you called, the shadow of the tower was 18 feet. He said 2 hours later, it was 123 feet. And I said if you had checked it later in the afternoon, you would have seen that the shadow of this tower stretched all the way across Cloverdale Park. How far can a shadow stretch? There is a statue in an eastern city in France. It is a statue of a black man. On his face is his expression of wistful sadness. And one day a young man stood in the shadow of that statue. His name was Albert Schweitzer. And he was so moved by the wistful sadness of that man's face that he gave up what was to be one of the most promising careers for any individual in all of Europe. And he went to the heart of darkest Africa, so that his dedicated life, filled with the power of God, might fall upon the life of someone else and so change it in the heart of darkest Africa. Many years ago, when this majestic structure was just a dream in the minds of a few people, two small boys were given a challenge by their mother. She said to them, if you make A's in school, perfect marks, then I will give each of you a $5 gold piece. One of the boys, a friend of mine and classmate, He received perfect marks and a great pride and joy when his mother gave to him that precious $5 gold piece. He kept it with him. He slept with it under his pillow. For Ed McGee, that $5 gold piece meant everything in the world to him. But he began to hear the conversation in the home about the possibility of a new church. One day he came to the priest of the church and he said, I understand you're thinking about building a new church. And the preacher said, yes. And he pulled out of his pocket that $5 gold piece. And he said, here, I want to give this to help build our church. Sometime later, two persons sat in the seats of honor, Bishop Warren Camler and this young boy, as they laid the cornerstone for this magnificent structure. How far can a shadow stretch? This congregation has mothered local congregations until they too could stand tall and send their shadows of influence around the world and locally as well. There are all sorts of shadows that are cast on the road of life. And sometimes the best are the unconscious shadows that we cast by our lives. When Vern and I were first married, we lived about a year in an apartment here in Montgomery. One beautiful spring day, we drove up into the hills around Wetumpka and visited Jasmine Hill. Coming back, we saw a sign, cabin for rent, cottage for rent. We went in through the gate, the estate called Rosebush Hill, right adjacent to Jasmine Hill. We went up to the top of the hill and asked the landlord, would like to see it. We came back and saw it, and beautiful, said we want it. He said, you're sixth in line. And you know, God intended that we get that cottage. We were sixth in line, but they called us one day and said, it is yours. And we moved out. We moved out to that place with the red buds and the dogwood and the wisteria and the fruit trees blooming, and God took me away from the life that I'd been living and some of the friends that I didn't need to be near, and took me at that place of solitude and began to talk to me. And in the influence of that place, and because of the shadow of influence that had been projected upon my life by even some of you, then God spoke to my heart one day and said, I hereby commission you to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. But up there, I remember, and it gets to the point of unconscious influence. I came home from work one day. Mara was frantic. She said, bees in the cottage. I thought maybe one or two. It just took one or two for her. And I went over and she said, they're in the wall. And I put my ear. It was a log cabin with pine paneling on the inside. And I put my ear to it. And they were busily making, their factory was going on. I said, I'll take care of this. I took some liquid DDT, and that's where I made the first mistake. And I poured it out of the window sill, and it trickled down the logs. That'll take care of them. And we began to sit reading, and the first thing you know, I began to see bees flying. What in the world? And then we looked at that paneling, and those bees were coming through the cracks in that pine paneling. We quickly tried to find something to stop them. Some old Christmas cotton was still somewhere around from the previous Christmas, and we began to stuff it in the pine paneling just to keep those bees from coming, but to no avail. I had a great idea. I got the Electrolux. I hooked it all up. I took the nozzle off the end. When they would fly around the room, I'd just take the nozzle of that and I just suck them in. And then I got a bag full. And the thought came to me, how in the world you going to empty a vacuum cleaner bag that's got a hive of bees in it? I threw some DDT in there and the fumes, and I sucked that up and took care of it. But all night long they kept coming. I thought about the influence of a person's life. And all of your life, it should keep coming. For 150 years. For 200. For 200 and 300 years. Throughout all eternity. The unconscious influence of a person's life should continue to come until it overwhelms your acquaintances, the members of your family, and all society and all the world, casting that shadow for Jesus Christ. I am delighted, as I have said earlier, to be a part of this sesquicentennial celebration. I thank those that have meant so much to me over the years, their unconscious influence, their shadows that have fallen upon my life. Zacchaeus fell under the shadow of Jesus Christ, and it so changed his life. The man in the temple with a withered hand fell under the shadow of Jesus Christ. He complained about no power, and Jesus said, "Stretch forth thy hand." And immediately the man, as he tried the impossible, the will of God became available to him. How far does a shadow stretch? Many years ago, I became very interested in Red Cross work, especially the blood program. That particular year, a little girl was on the poster of the Red Cross promotional material. Her name was Pamela Springman, and I found out something about her. She was just 7 years of age. Her father was head of the music department of the University of Maryland. Pamela had spoken at many Red Cross blood drives. She was a victim of leukemia, and she had begun a program by saying, "I want to thank Jesus Christ for giving me life, and I want to thank the Red Cross for giving me blood." Some thoughtless reporter once said to Pamela, "Pamela, if God has been so good to you, why hasn't He cured you from this leukemia?" And she looked up at him and with the simple faith and sincerity of a child said, "Sir, if God had healed me of my leukemia, I would not have this witness to make from Him." Pamela had undergone at that time something like 150 blood transfusions, completely changing all the blood in her body. Her temperature would rise to 104 degrees. They'd have to pack her in ice for the duration of the 4 and 5 hours that it took for those transfusions. Peg Sprigman said that one night he was sitting on the bed of Pamela, ready to have that evening prayer with that little girl, and Pamela, like so many other children, were asking this parent, as they do to us, those unanswerable questions. And she had asked him some, and he had to say, "I don't know." And then that little girl said to him, "Daddy, what you're trying to say, is it not, that what people need is a Jesus transfusion?" How far does a shadow stretch? You see, the reason that Peter had any power at all, and these people, even in their superstition, believed that his shadow could heal them, because he had been associated with Jesus Christ. And the amount of his power was directly related to his relationship to Jesus Christ. How far can a shadow stretch? Casting shadows for good will depend upon your and my relationship to Jesus Christ. May the next 1,000 years, may the shadow of influence, those shadows that are cast for Christ, encircle the globe. May God bless you.